Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to an all-new Sermons in the Park. As always, I am your Reverend Jamie McCaskill. I'd like to take this time right now, because I am recording this on Mother's Day, to thank all of you mothers for all the work that you've done, and to tell you all a great and happy Mother's Day. I wish you all a happy Mother's Day. And if you're watching this and you go out and spend time with your mother today, show her how happy you are, how much you love her, how much she means to you. Because we're all limited on our time with our mothers, and we should all spend time with them. Fathers, spend time with your child's mother. Get her a gift. Show her how much you care for her. So thank you all for joining me here. It's a great and wonderful, like I tell you each and every week, for me to be here with you each and every Sunday. Let us take this time to bow our heads and thank our Heavenly Father for all that He's done for us. Heavenly Father, we come to you once again here on this beautiful Sunday to tell you thank you for all that you've done, to praise your name. You're wonderful and loving God. You care for us more than we deserve, Father, and that's just your grace. And we thank you for that. We thank you for the forgiveness for sins. We thank you for the breath that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, the animals that we get to see, the beautiful sights that you've created. Father, everybody was afraid of that storm not long ago, and I stepped out behind my house, Father, and I looked up to the heavens as that rolling thunder was coming over, and it just was a beautiful sight. To see that lightning streaking inside of those clouds, it was beautiful. Thank you for that sight, God. Thank you for that. You're amazing. And Father, you do such wonderful things for us. You work for us on molecular levels, on things that there are things you do that we can't see, feel, or touch. And it's all because of you. You're working in our lives to heal us, to guide us in the right direction. And we thank you for that, Father. We thank you for all that you do. You're so wonderful. Amen. So, if you're new, I want to take this time to welcome you to the family. I hope that you continue to watch us. If you're returning, welcome back. I'm so glad to see you again. Here we are. If you haven't been watching, what we do here is we read and review a whole chapter. We look at a book. We take a book of the Bible and we break it down chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And I'll say this again, like I do every time I say this. Sometimes we do it word by word, because there are words in the Bible that mean something different to us now than it did in the past. Okay. So I break that down for you. I tell you where the locations are sometimes when I can find them, because it's hard to go online and look these things up sometimes and find, this was here, and I do my best to break that down for you, and that's how we do it. And if you're coming in now, we're in the book of Judges. We're in chapter 16. We're reading about Samson, and I believe this week we're going to be reading about Delilah. That's where we are this week. Like I said, here we are in chapter 16, and we're still reading that story of Samson. And we see how God is merciful, okay? And He delivers Samson from iniquity. But you see, we're going to see that Samson gets brought down a peg or two here soon. Sin blinds us. Today, we don't see that how we're doing wrong, and we see here with Samson. Samson is also blinded by sin, and then just like Samson, that sin grinds us down. Here at the beginning of chapter 16, we see a mention of a city called Gaza, and I'm right now, if you know, I've been writing out notes and things for sermons of Genesis, and I've been reading about Gaza. Gaza was the capital city of the Philistines. Okay, it was down on the southern coast along a caravan route that came up from Egypt and into Syria, and Samson would travel into this enemy territory. It kind of shows us just how extreme, okay, Samson's lusts are. So let us go ahead and read. We're going to read, like I said, Judges chapter 16. We're going to read the entire chapter. I'm sorry, this will be a long one. This chapter is 31 verses. Then went Samson to Gaza, and saw there a harlot, and went in unto her. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all the night, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. And Samson lay till midnight, arose at midnight, took the doors of the gate of the city, and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulder, and carried them up the top of a hill that is before Hebron. And it came to pass afterwards that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. I want you to pay attention to that, because they said every one of us. And Delilah said to Samson, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. And Samson said unto her, If they bind me with 7 green withes that were never dried, then shall I be weak, and be as another man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withes, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now there were men lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber. And she said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the withes, and a thread of tow is as a thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire. So his strength was not known. And Delilah said unto Samson, Behold, thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If they bind me fast with new ropes, that never were occupied, then shall I be weak, and be as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes, bound him therewith, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liers in wait, abiding in the chamber. He broke them from off his arms like a thread. And Delilah said unto Samson, Hitherto thou hast mocked me, and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. And she fastens it with a pin, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awaked out of his sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam, and with the web. Okay. And she said unto him, How canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy strength lieth. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death, that he told her all his heart, and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak, and be like another man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lord of the Philistines came up unto her, and brought money in their hand. And she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. And she told the Philistines, "Be upon thee," she said, "The Philistines be upon thee, Samson." And he awoke out of his sleep and said, "I will go out as at other times before, and shake myself." And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him, and put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza, and bound him with fetters and brass, and did grind in the prison house. He did grind in the prison house, sorry. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again, after he was shaven. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God hath delivered Samson our enemy into our hand." And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us." And it came to pass, when their hearts were merry, that they said, "Call for Samson, that he may make us sport." And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport. And they set him between the pillars. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, "Suffer me, that I may fill the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them." Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof, I want you to catch that part, about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee. Only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, or the one with his right hand, and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him, and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel for 20 years. Okay, now if you're new here, what we do, we take that, we just read the whole chapter, okay? Then we'll go back, we'll reread each verse one at a time, and I like to say discuss it, but I talk to you about it. I explain things to you to where you can understand it a little bit better, okay? So let's go back and let's reread verse 1 now. Then went Samson to Gaza, and saw there a harlot, and went in unto her. Now, like we talked about here is Gaza, right? Gaza was one of the 5 principalities of the Philistines, and it was somewhere like I'd say 10 miles from Ashkelon. I found that it was described as standing on a hill, and it was surrounded by valleys, and these valleys were enclosed by hills as well, okay? Most of them were planted with all different kinds of fruit. I also saw where it said that Gaza was about 42 miles from Ramoth Lehi, which is where, if you remember, Samson threw the jawbone of the ass. Anyway, why did Samson even go here in the first place? I mean, sure, it shows that he was very bold, right? It shows that he was courageous, because he had, if you listened last week, he had just slaughtered all of those Philistines. I mean, he had to have expected some kind of trouble, okay? This Gaza was a very strong city, and here he was exposed. I mean, it is possible that this was, a good years later, after he had done all this slaying. Anyway, the verse actually says, and he saw there a harlot and went in unto her. Now, one thing that I did find interesting, that I look at different translations, some of the older ones, like the Targum and the Septuagint and all that. The Targum does not call this woman a harlot. The Targum actually says that she's an innkeeper. And this is how many other biblical scholars actually interpret it as well. So it is possible that this is just someone's house that Samson went to when he went for lodging and entertainment when he was in that area. It's very possible that this woman was just an innkeeper, but it is also possible that she was an innkeeper and a harlot. Getting yourself a little extra money, if you will. It can be it can be that Samson was in her house, and another person, a harlot, came in, and this harlot captivated him, and Samson went into her. Maybe he just had a criminal conversation with her. We don't know. Anyway, the reason for his visit is very unclear. We do not know that is why he was there. I really doubt that it was just to visit a harlot. But he saw her, and she ensnared him. Okay? I mean, there would have been many hostesses, if you will, in a lot of these cities. And it would not be hard for them to be, a prostitute, to prostitute themselves out. This happens today. I remember when I lived in Shreveport, there was a whole restaurant that shut down because a lot of the waitresses in this place were prostituting themselves out. Okay, also let me point out again that this city, Gaza, is a Philistine city. So she probably would have been a Philistine herself. Okay, so anyway, let's move on from that verse. Let's go on to verse 2 now. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all the night, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. It's talking about this is not just every man, okay? It's not saying just the normal citizen. This would have been the principal citizens, the higher-ups, the magistrates, if you will. Someone, it appears, saw Samson coming, possibly heard his name when he was talking to the harlot, because the verse says, saying, Samson has come hither. So somebody heard him, and this also tells us another thing, that Samson's name carried strength with it. The Philistines knew who he was by now. But I bet you they were all terrified when they heard his name. Okay? The verse says that, and they compassed him in. Now, this does not mean that they encircled the house. Okay? I think they just kind of blocked off the streets. They locked the gates to the city. And they did it very quickly. Probably placing guards around town, trying to stop Samson from escaping. It says, and laid wait for him all night in the gate. Now, specifically, a certain gate. Do you notice that it says the gate? The one that he probably used when he entered the town, or when he was passing through, if you will. The verse then says, and were quiet all night. What this means is they did not go and wake Samson up. Remember, they knew where he was. They just let him stay there. They did not try to seize him. They knew that Samson had strength. And they knew that they could raise the city, or I should say that Samson could raise that city to the ground. I bet they even kept their plan quiet. They didn't even tell anyone else that Samson was there. The verse then says, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. Notice it says in the morning. Why? Because they could see him better, right? They'd be able to see Samson better. They could see him coming. They could move quicker, take him unawares, if you will, just as he came to the gate. Now remember that these Philistines are his enemy. The Philistines are Samson's enemy, but the Philistines are also God's enemy. Okay? These Philistines, they want to kill Samson. Think about how bad they wanted him dead. They heard he was with this harlot. They waited all night for him. They were sure that when he came out the next morning, they were going to be able to take him out. Okay? Now, let's look what Samson does here in verse 3. This is very interesting. And Samson lay till midnight, arose at midnight, took the doors of the gate of the city, and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulder, and carried them up to the top of a hill that is before Hebron. Think about this. Just think about it. These gates, they're huge. They're huge gates that were made, they were made in these Near East villages. They were, if you were to look at them, look up pictures of them, look at the history of these things, they were huge. And they were covered in metal as a way to kind of prevent them from being burned. We talked about this a while back when we were talking about that one story where they're covered in metal so that they can't be burned. Think about how heavy they were. The weight of this door, the joists, the door, the bar, and all. And we see Samson pick this thing up, put it on his shoulders, and he carries it 30 miles uphill to Hebron. These things are extremely heavy. And I do not think extremely is even a good enough word to describe it. Amen? Samson, he has incredible strength that was given to him by God. You see why I said uphill? It actually says the hilltop before Hebron. Like I said, this was 40 miles away. Yes, this was a superhuman feat to be accomplished. But don't make any doubts in your mind. This was a self-serving thing. It was done out of anger, and it was also done to mock the Philistines. It was not just some simple escape that we see. Notice that we see a combination here. Samson's strength and his moral weakness. Samson was not afraid of these Philistines at all. He left that city at midnight, okay, with the doors of the gate and the 2 posts on his shoulder. Not only did he leave, he made sure that anyone that could come and go, if you were coming into that city, you were more than welcome to walk in. There's no gates to stop you. If you want to get away, there's no stopping you. The gates are gone. You can come and go as you please. Notice that as we move on, that we see the mention of these Philistines, these lords who ruled over each city. This actually underscores that capturing Samson was their number 1 priority. The lords, they actually started to realize that they would never be able to defeat Samson. Not in war, at least. Not with strength. They decided they would use his weaknesses, his infatuation with this woman, where we get Delilah, okay? Now, poor Samson. Poor Samson. Read verse 4 with me. And it came to pass afterwards that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Samson's weakness is women. Not only women, but women of low character. Ones that tended to be loyal to the Philistines. In verse 4, I want you to notice something. It says that he loved Delilah. I want you to catch that. The Bible never once tells you that Delilah loves Samson. all these people who like to look at these characters and they go, oh, I want a relationship like so and so and so and so. Oh, the love of Samson and Delilah. No, it was the love from Samson for Delilah. The Bible makes that clear, that Samson loved Delilah. It never once says that Delilah loved Samson. Anyway, Samson makes a mistake, and he visits Delilah daily. This allows him to be entrapped by her lies, her deceptions. I found nothing about the city that she lived in. I did a lot of searching. I could find nothing. Only thing I could find out about it was that Samson lived there. That's it. It's believed that Delilah also was a Philistine as well. But again, we're not 100% on that. Let's move on to verse 5 now. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to what they just offered her. Think about this. There's 5 lords, okay? Remember that. There's 5 of them. Each one of them will pay Delilah 1,100 shekels. That is 5,500 shekels. That is a huge amount. When you do a little bit of research into that, that is 550 times the annual wage from that time period. That's 3 times more silver than the gold that Gideon received when he defeated the Midianites. That shows you just how desperate these Philistine lords are. They had to have known that this strength was supernatural. But they did not know that it was coming from God. Because you see, the Philistines, they had no idea what a Nazirite vow was, or that Samson even made the Nazirite vow. The thing about seduction is this. It's usually very subtle, and it will expose your vulnerability, inch by inch. Now, Delilah, when we read on, you'll see she tries 3 times to get Samson to reveal the source of his power. But notice that he reveals something, he reveals a little bit of it each time without giving away his secret. But he stays with her, doesn't he? And this leads to his demise, and eventually to him revealing the truth to her. Moving on, let's look at verse 6 here. And Delilah said to Samson, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. Now, Josephus tells us that Delilah waited. She waited until the right time, while she had him in her arms and she was caressing him, and she introduced it in a very sly manner. She probably was, admiring stories, right? He probably was sitting there telling her, I slew all these Philistines with and she probably was doing it while he was doing that, just wondering how he could perform them. So she asked him, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, right? She asks it in a way that made Samson think that she was just curious. And like it would, prove that he loved her if he were to tell her this great secret. It says that she says, and wherewith thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. Now, she probably didn't say it in a way that made Samson think that she would do this, okay? Or that she would even do it to him. But just that she wanted to know, if he was bound, how could it be done so that he would not be able to escape? She probably knew about the first time. He probably even had told her. But she wanted to know, if there was a way that he could be bound without escaping. Now, why in the world would anyone who is seemingly undefeatable tell someone how they can be defeated? Make no mistake. This is what she's asking him. And she's doing this because she wants money. Now, now that I'm thinking about it now, maybe she even, when I said she probably knew about the first time, maybe he told her that story and then she asked a question. It's a possibility, right? Anyway, let's move on. Let's go to verse 7. And Samson said unto her, if they bind me with 7 green withes that were never dried, then shall I be weak and be as another man. So Samson, he starts playing a game with her here. Okay, he gives away his manhood a little, a little at a time. He plays with her, right? And then he eventually tells her his secret. He could be bought for a price, and Delilah pays it. Compare this to Esau, and when Esau sells his birthright. And of course, then Judas later sells Jesus away with a kiss. This verse here says that he would be just like a normal man. I want to just to bear this in your mind, okay? Samson was not a giant, not like Hollywood have you think. He was not physically strong. Samson's strength didn't come from his giant muscles. He wasn't Arnold or any of these great actors that were performed with their muscles. Samson would not have had these. Samson's strength came from the Lord. Think about this. I want you to just think about this. If, say, Samson looked like Hulk Hogan did back in the 80s, or the Ultimate Warrior, that would be a good comparison. Warrior with his long hair and his big muscles. If Samson looked like the Ultimate Warrior, if Samson was physically strong like the Ultimate Warrior, why are the Philistines wanting to know where his strength come from? Because if Samson looked like the Ultimate Warrior, you would know where his strength came from. You would be able to look at him and know that man is strong. Anyway, here in verse 7, we see him lie to Delilah. Okay? So, let's move on to verse 8. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withes which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. So they brought these ropes to her, right, into her chamber where Samson was sleeping. Of course, after she told them what he said, okay? It says that they brought these 7 green withes which had not been dried. Exactly what Samson told her. Then it says, and she bound him with them. So she took advantage of the fact that Samson was asleep. Maybe even, Josephus says that he might have been drunk. I don't know. But notice that the Philistines, they did not do this themselves. They were probably afraid that they might wake Samson, because he would kill them if they woke him, wouldn't he? But Samson, he loved Delilah. So if she lied and said, I just wanted to see if you told me the truth, right? Withes were what we actually now call a catgut. They're a type of string. Surgeons use them today to sew people up because of how strong they are. Anyway, let's move on to verse 9 now. Now there were men lying in wait, abiding with her in the chamber, and she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he broke the withes as thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire, so his strength was not known. So the Philistines that are mentioned here, these are not the lords. They probably were just servants. They probably sent them there just to make sure that the job was done. And to, well, of course, kill Samson when he was bound. Josephus calls them soldiers. I don't know if you knew that or not. I find that interesting. Anyway, the verse says that they were abiding with her in the chamber. honestly, when I think of this, they had to have been in some private part of her chamber. Maybe the room next door or something like that. Or you can't say that they were lying in wait, right? So this was probably some room that was off of her room, or maybe if she was in an apartment, it was like the one next door. The verse then tells us, and she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. So she wakes Samson up, okay? She tells him that the Philistines were there, ready to take him. I think she did this just to see if he could in fact break the wives, before she called on these men. Remember, she probably did not know if it was true or not, because the verse goes on to say, and he brake the withes as a thread of tow is broken when it touches the fire. Now, a thread of tow is what we would call linen. Now, when it catches fire, as soon as it gets hot near the fire, it'll catch fire. It's so weak that it breaks easily. So these withes, they broke as soon as Samson moved his arms. The verse then goes on to say, so his strength was not known. This means that Delilah or the Philistines, they still did not know where it came from. They wanted to take that strength away from him. They were there to kill him, of course, right? They wanted to kill him as soon as that strength was gone. These Philistines are terrified of Samson. They wanted to make sure that he was tied tight before they attacked him. He had already killed thousands of them. Neither of them want to be the next one to die. Amen? And we see here that they wanted to see if his strength was really taken from him. Right? So Delilah calls out. And it says the ropes basically fall off. So let's move on. Verse 10. And Delilah said unto Samson, behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. Now, we're going to be talking about this a little bit as we go along. But this was something that me as a man, okay, growing up, I always kept thinking to myself, why did he keep going back to her? Why did Samson keep going back to her? Well, in my studying here, I learned a little bit, because honestly, if you go to someone and they blatantly double cross you, why would you go back to them again? Because when you read this, it sounds like it's the next day. But I read where David Kimchi, was a rabbi from the 12th century, and he said that this had to have happened a few days later, because like I said, think about it. If she had done this the same day, like we always thought she did, or even the next day, wouldn't you be a little suspicious? But the verse tells us that Delilah says to him, behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. So Delilah tells him, right, you lied to me. Because he had told her that if she had bound him with these green withes, that he would be weak. Weak as just like a normal man. And as far as Samson knows, I should say, Delilah was just curious and she tied him up. And then she found out that it wasn't true. She could have added, right, that he did not love her, or he would not have mocked her in this way, right? The verse then goes on to say, now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. So she's pretending that she was embarrassed. Oh, Samson, why did you do that to me? She's trying to get him to tell her the real reason, where it comes from. Now, even knowing this, that this could have been days later or a month later, I don't understand why he sat there and listened to this. I don't. This had to have been God's will. Am I wrong? Am I right or am I wrong here? It had to have been God's will. Why would anyone sit there and listen to this? I don't care how much you love that person. When you see that they're going to betray you like this. So let's move on. Let's look at verse 11 here. And he said unto her, if they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Now, I want to point out that I found in my research that 15th century Bible commentator, a guy named Abernell, presented a thought. He presented a thought that Samson would have first told her that, I told you the truth. I just forgot to mention this. So if you go by that, if you go by that right there, that little bit of a thought there, these cords or these withes should have been new, right? Unused. The verse says, if they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied. But the word here would actually mean a thick rope, right? Which means they were made of 3 cords that were twisted. Okay? And yes, they were made that way even back then. And Samson is saying that they had to be new, right? Never used, making them very strong, very firm. A new rope. A new rope. If anything was going to hold Samson, it should be a new rope. What Samson's doing here is he's delaying. He's delaying her. Okay? So let's look at verse 12 here. Delilah, therefore, she took new ropes, bound him wherewith, and said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber, and he brake them from his arms like a thread. Look what she does here. She tries again. She ties him up. Okay? No Philistines were there in the room with her. They're hiding. They're waiting. Again, testing her. She's testing Samson again. The verse tells us, and said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. These are the exact same words that Delilah used earlier. In the same way. Okay? The verse says, and there were liars in wait, abiding in the chamber. They were awaiting their signal. They're hiding away. They're waiting for Delilah to let them know, hey, it worked, right? And as you know, the verse says, and he brake them off of his arms like a thread. Think about what that just said. Grab a piece of thread. Do you have one? Grab it. Try to pull it apart. See how easily that broke? Samson broke brand new rope like it was a thread. Now, the name Delilah, if you were to look it up, means amorous. And Delilah was greedy. I believe that she is pretending to love Samson. I really do. I think she's pretending. She just wants to help these Philistines capture Samson, that she can get paid. It's sad, but it's true. I honestly think that she had no feelings for him. I think that was straight up just greed. Okay, verse 13 now. And Delilah said unto Samson, hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, if thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. Jeannie, if you're watching, this is what I was telling you about at work. I think this happens sometime later again. I think that this is days or months later, and she's teasing Samson about deceiving her. That's what I think. The verse says that she says, hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now, Samson's done this to her twice. And he pretends to tell her his great secret. And she says to him, tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. She's saying, tell me the truth, Samson. Stop teasing me. Stop playing with me. The verse says, and he said unto her, if thou weavest the 7 locks of my head with the web. Now, this is interesting. This tells us that his hair was braided into locks. They would have, of course, hung down very long, right? And he tells her that if she were to take his 7 locks and was to wrap them with wrap them on a loom nearby, maybe, who knows? Maybe Delilah was a weaver. She had to make her money some way. This would have been normal for her. That if she were to do this, that, Samson's saying, if you were to take my hair and weave it in the loom, if you will, I'll be weakened. Now, I think that Samson was a little too love-struck with Delilah here. He just can't seem to see what she's doing. He doesn't see that Delilah doesn't care for him. She's constantly trying to find, where his strength comes from. But again, we see him lie to her, don't we? So let's move on. Verse 14. And she fastened it with the pin, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awaked out of his sleep, went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. So this has been what she did afterwards. After she took his locks and she weaved them and warped them, and she fastened them in the beams with some sort of a pin or maybe a loom or the web. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know this speech. Just remember that it is italicized. Notice that. It says it, and it's italicized. And she fastened with the pin. That's what it actually says there. Could this mean them? Because Samson's hair, the 7. Could it be them? Anyway, what we read here is that when Samson fell asleep, Delilah took these 7 locks and she wove them into the web. And then she fastened them with a pin to the wall. That's what it says. And then it says, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. Again, she's using these same words here that she used before. The verse goes on to say, and he awaked out of his sleep. This shows us that, again, Samson was asleep when she did all of this. And again, this man sleeps here. Do you notice that? She keeps doing this when he's asleep. Why would you fall asleep there? Why would you even think that I should sleep here after she does all this to him? Anyway, the verse says, and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. So, he carried this all off with him. Remember now, it's woven into his hair. So either he carried it, picked it up, drug it with him, or he just walked out of there with it dragging behind him. Now, the Septuagint and the Vulgate actually have it say that he pulled the pin of the web out of the wall. Delilah tries everything that Samson tells her. Every time he tells her, this will weaken me, she tries it. He's so strong that the web that she had woven in his hair was destroyed when he woke up. That's right. So, all right, let's move on. Verse 15 now. And she said unto him, How canst thou say, I love thee, when thine heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth. Now, here again, Delilah is taking this time, right? Maybe while they were caressing one another, maybe they had made love, if you will. Maybe they're, he's got his head in her lap and she's stroking his hair, or, eating grapes, or not grapes, but figs or something, and they're relaxing. So she's taking that time to prod him with the love. She tells him that he's mocking her, and that he has mocked her 3 times. She's urging him, tell me where this strength comes from. Remember, he had done this 3 times. First he with the withes, right? Then he did it with the ropes, and then of course the web. She's saying, how can you say you love me and haven't told me where the strength comes from? The very thing that she's constantly asking him. She's accusing. Now here she is, and I'm sure many of us have been in a situation like this. She's telling Samson, if you won't tell me these things, it's because you don't love me. Again, I point out, not once do we read where Delilah tells Samson that she loves him. No, she's accusing Samson. If you loved me, you would do these things. Why doesn't Delilah tell him that she loves him? Notice that she brings this up, that you've done this to me 3 times. This is abusive. This is very abusive. And again, if Delilah loved Samson, we would read about it. But again, if she loved him, why would she agree to do this? So let's move on to verse 16 now. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, and urged him, so that his soul was vexed unto death. Okay? So she came after him every day. She's trying to get this secret out of him. She gives him no rest. She's incessant. The verse says that she pressed him daily with her words. Even though she was disappointed, she persevered. She knew that Samson loves her. She knew he was a slave to her passions. So she came after him over and over again until she got what she wanted. She nags him. Okay? Now let's look at verse 17. He told her all his heart, and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak, and be like any other man. Notice the verse actually says, if I be shaven. Now remember, his strength did not come from just his hair. We've discussed this in the past. That's not where his strength comes from. It comes from his pledge as a Nazarite. This unique relationship that Samson has with God. And that hair was just a sign of that pledge. I believe it was here, right here, when he showed that Delilah was more important than God. I believe that this was the moment that his strength was really removed. I don't think it was when his hair was come off, because the hair did not have any magical powers. Unlike Hollywood and books would have you believe, there was no magical power to that hair. It was the fact that Samson was a Nazarite unto God. That hair, and I want to repeat, that hair was just an outward sign of his dedication. It's kind of like a wedding ring. If you were to take that wedding ring off, you're still married. But when you take that ring off, you're breaking that vow, because you're taking it off to go and cheat with another woman or something like that. That ring is just a symbol of your marriage. Okay? It was the hair was just a sign of the dedication that enabled Samson to do the mighty deeds that he done. It's sad to think that Samson would give this woman the knowledge that could hurt him. I like, all these years, I have never understood why someone would do that. Delilah provoked him into telling the truth. Now remember, she did not know what a Nazarite was. And that is why we see him give her the details about that vow. He tells her the truth this time, doesn't he? Okay, let's look at verse 18 now. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he has shown me his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and brought money in their hand. By saying that he told her all of his heart, this is telling us that she could tell he was serious. So she knew that she just learned a secret. We see the verse tell us that the lords of the Philistines brought money in their hands. One of the bravest men in the world was bought and sold like sheep. Sheep that was about to be slaughtered. Delilah was sure this time. Samson told her the truth. How could Samson not see what she was up to? Remember, her whole plan was to give him to the Philistines and to collect the silver. And this time, the Philistines believed her as well. Because we see that they brought the money with them to pay her. Okay, let's go to verse 19 now. And she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. When it says that she made him sleep, now, I have a lot to say on this verse. Some like to think that Delilah must have given him some kind of a sleeping potion or something. But she could have just told him, Samson, come here, lover, lay your head on my lap. Take yourself a nap. Because she knew that Samson loved her. The verse then says, and she called for a man. This could have been maybe the barber, right? Because shaving was a job that was done by the servants at the time. So she told them to send for someone. Now, 11th century, Jarkey, who was an 11th, you've heard me mention him several times. He was an 11th century rabbi. He calls this man a messenger of the lords of the Philistines. Okay. The verse says, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. This shows us that they were not woven into one another like one large lock. I mention this because some have actually said that it was. Okay? The verse goes on to tell us, and she began to afflict him. So, as his hair was being shaven off, Delilah started to afflict him. She was torturing him herself. That way they could see that it was that it was working. The verse tells us, and his strength went from him. This verse possibly is possibly telling us that it was a gradual thing. Okay, some have said that the afflicting was her, shaking Samson, trying to wake him up, possibly with her cry about the Philistines again. They also may have bound him as well. And this makes sense because they noticed that his strength was gone. Remember, he did not get his power from his hair. I want to make that perfectly clear. I want to make sure that you understand this. The hair was just a symbol. It was the Nazirite vow that gave Samson his strength. As long as Samson kept his hair, the vow was active. Okay? It was the fact that God was within him that gave him his strength. His hair being cut was only a symbol that vow was broken. Okay. I know I've got some people who watch me who love numerology. So for you, okay, I want you to see the number 7. That number 7 is spiritually linked. It means complete. Perhaps Samson chose 7 as a way of showing that he stood with God. And now that his strength is gone, Samson is just a normal man. We're also about to read some of the saddest words in the Bible. And those words are, the Lord was departed from him. This is similar to what we see in Numbers. Let's look real quick. I haven't done this today, but we're going to now. It's being really slow. I'm sorry, it's being really slow. Might go a lot slower than it usually is. Didn't click that. The book of Numbers, chapter 14, verses 42 and 43. It reads, Go not up, for the Lord is not among you, that ye be not smitten before your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and ye shall fall by the sword, because ye are turned away from the Lord. Therefore the Lord will not be with you. We see this pathetic Samson is later paraded through the city. He's helpless. He's no longer this champion of Israel, is he? Now he's this prisoner of the Philistines. He's a slave to his own sins. He lived a life that was right in his own eyes. Okay? And now here he is. He's lost his sight. I found that interesting that, he's blinded by his own sins. So let's move on. Verse 20 now. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before, and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord was departed from him. Right there. Do you see that? There they are. He wist not that the Lord was departed from him. This is the tragedy of abandonment. He had forfeited his power of having the Lord there with him so that he could enjoy his sins. This had to be sad. Can you imagine how he felt when he woke up? He'd gone to bed. He had all the strength of the Lord. And then he wakes up and it's gone. He broke his vow. I want you to notice, though, he did not feel a physical difference, though. No, because things felt the same to him. But they weren't, were they? Why was Samson in this predicament? Because he loved a beautiful woman. And that was it. He loved beautiful women. He was lust. Lust was Samson's sin. Okay, verse 21. But the Philistines took him, put out his eyes, brought him down to Gaza, bound him with fetters and brass, and he did grind in the prison house. They took him to Gaza. This was the last town that we read about Samson visiting, and it was here where he was humiliated. So now that Samson did not have the strength of the Lord, they bound him easily, and the first thing we see them doing is poking out his eyes. In those days, that was the most cruel punishment you could give to someone. It was worse than death. And having him grind, that's degrading. That is essentially what they would have slaves do. Okay, verse 22. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. The verse tells us that his hair began to grow, just like his repentance did, right? And his strength came back with the hair. Hopefully, as we've been reading here, you've noticed that God's purposes are not jeopardized. No matter how far you fall away, your story is never finished. The fact that we read that his hair began to grow back, this shows us that God still had work for Samson to do. Samson is going to accomplish the purpose that God created him for. That is to deliver the Israelites out of the hands of the Philistines. Do you remember what I said about the Nazirite vow? Just because the vow is broken does not mean that you cannot start a new one, that you cannot be restored. That is what we see when we read that Samson's hair is growing back. He was back in covenant with God. The hair, like I told you, was just a symbol. It symbolizes the presence of that vow. Samson's strength was returning to him because he's now filled with the power of God again. And just like any other pagan, the Philistines believed in their god, Dagon. Dagon had been responsible for them capturing the great Samson in their eyes. Okay? Notice, their celebration is short-lived, though, isn't it? Because just like every time, God's servant proves God's sovereignty. Amen. Let's move on, verse 23. The Lord of the Philistines gathered themselves together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, Our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. We're seeing him right here, aren't we? We're seeing Dagon. Now, Dagon was believed to be a sea god. You can find pictures of him, and they show that he has the head of a man, the body of a fish. Dagon is often identified with Dagon, who was a god of grain. And it's often mentioned in writings from the Mesopotamia area. Dagon and Dagon, they're often called a grain god in the Canaanite writings. He probably had a similar status with the Philistines. Did you know that Dagon, D-A-G-A-N, actually means grain in Hebrew? Yeah, the word probably came from the name of this false god. Them gathering together here, this was probably a festival. They are, of course, celebrating that they had captured Samson. And they're giving all the credit to Dagon, their false god. Now, we will read about a lot of casualties here, but I want to let you know, archaeologists have proven that large-scale deaths like this were actually possible. Not only that, they've also found a Philistine temple, like the ones that we described here, in Tel Kisal. This temple would have had people, underneath of this roofed patio, and there would have been this huge crowd that would have gathered on top of the roof, and then one on the side so that they could all see Samson. And the pillars collapsing, this would have killed a large number, and it would have done it instantly. Not only with this, was this an act of vengeance on Samson's part, but it also wiped out the leadership of the Philistines, because they're sitting there, and they're sitting there. They're watching this. All this is going on. They're there. It ends the oppression of Israel, and it instantly. Finally, we see Samson act selflessly, I should say. It justifies his place among the heroes of faith that we read about in Hebrews. I haven't read that with you guys lately, so we'll go ahead and read it this time. In Hebrews 11:32. And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. So yeah, let's move on now. Let's go on to verse 24. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, and they said, Our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. So the Philistines, it says, they praised their God. I found it very sad that, someone's sin could lead the unsaved to give praise to a false god. When we all know that there's only one true God, and he deserves all the praise. This false god, Dagon, can do nothing. He's made up. False. This was all caused by Samson. He did this to himself. He once was this mighty warrior of God. He gave up all of it for a woman who, let's face it, did not love him back. It was God's plan to destroy the Philistines. He wanted to free his people. He wanted to free Israel. Samson had destroyed so many of these Philistines single-handedly until he broke that Nazirite vow by telling Delilah where that strength come from. I want you to pay attention when we read the next verse. We see the word sport, and it's said twice. This is actually a variant of a Hebrew word that means to laugh. They're actually calling for Samson to entertain them. We know that this entertainment would not be connected to his strength because he doesn't have it anymore. It would have been because he was blind. They probably are placing things in front of him and watching him trip over them so that they can laugh at a blind man. It's sad. And what's sad about this is if you watch the world today, the way that people treat each other, they'll watch some man or woman get quote unquote what they call canceled, and they make fun of them. It's similar. Anyway, verse 25. And it came to pass that when their hearts were merry, that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport. And they set him between the pillars. Their hearts are merry because they're drunk. They're drinking wine. You can find a lot of historical writings about the wine of Gaza. It was very famous. They would have been drinking, they would have been eating, they would have probably been dancing, there would have been music. We talked about this earlier when we were doing this series, that these heathen cultures, they would feast in their temples quite often. And there should be no doubt that they were doing this here in this verse. The verse actually says, and they said, Call for Samson that he may make us sport. So we can gather from this that Samson was not there. He wasn't in the temple. He was in the prison somewhere. So the people cried out because they wanted him. They wanted him fetched so that they could make fun of him. The verse says, and they called for Samson out of the prison house. They sent some messenger, right, to go and get Samson for them. The verse then says, and he made them sport. I do not think that this means that he did it on his own. Why would he want to make them laugh? I think that he bore it patiently, though. They were mocking him. They were spitting on him. Again, this is another one that makes me think of Jesus. This would have been a great diversion for them to see this once mighty man, Samson, rattling chains, groping about, right? Tripping over things, trying to reach for a different pillar or a post. I bet that some would have been slapping him and punching him in the ears, plucking at his nose, right? His beard, spitting in his face, taunting him. The verse says, and they set him between the pillars. They put him between the pillars so they could see him better from wherever they were. I can hear them now saying, Here he is, the mighty Samson, and showing him off how hopeless he was. Here's this great killer of the Philistines. And they probably loved seeing him that way. I think that them bringing him back to these pillars shows us that they were probably getting bored of him. Let's look at verse 26 now. And Samson said unto the lad that held his hand, Suffer me that I may fill the pillars, whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. This young man was probably leading Samson around by the hand. This was a common thing back then. Blind men would often be led around by some young boy. We read that he says, Suffer me that I may fill the pillars whereupon the house standeth. He seems to have known that this temple was supported by these pillars. And if he had never been there before, he lost his sight, he seems to have learned about it somehow. He knew that he was near the pillars. But, since he was blind, he just did not know which way to put his hands so that he could fill them. So we read that he asks this young man to guide him between the pillars. He says, that I may lean upon them. He must have been acting like he was tired. That's actually what Josephus tells us. Either from grinding the mill or being led through this place, being jeered at. So anyway, verse 27 now. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. This building was full. There were people from all over gathered here. And the verse tells us, and the lords of the Philistines were there. This would have been those 5 lords from Gaza, from Ashdod, from Ashkelon, from Gath, from Ekron. All of them were gathered there. The verse tells us, and there were upon the roof 3,000 men and women. Now, the roof of this building, it would have been flat, like other houses in Canaan and Phoenicia, which we can read about. Let's do that. Deuteronomy 22:8. When thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement for the roof, that thou bring not blood upon thine house, if any man fall from thence. There could possibly have been windows in several different places where people could have seen in, right? The verse tells us that beheld while Samson made sport. They were there laughing at him. And treating him like a clown. This was a lot of Philistines partying there. Okay? Think about the weight of that roof. There's 3,000 people. This shows us the strength of these pillars that are holding this roof up. So Samson removing them would just bring that whole thing down. We see Samson now. He's humble. He's praying for the opportunity. As he says, that I may be once avenged of the Philistines for gouging out his eyes, right? The Hebrew word for bowed is actually a twisting motion, telling us that Samson turned the pillars off their bases, removing the support of the roof, causing it to collapse. Now, sadly, Samson accomplishes more in his death than he did in the 20 years that he was a judge. Even though unfaithfulness does not prevent God's purpose in our lives, it will prove tragic for those who are unfaithful. Verse 28 now. And Samson called upon the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee. Only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Samson calls on the Lord in a very pious way, in a mental prayer. Now, I do suppose that it is possible that he says this out loud, okay? And that people just do not hear him. They're probably being loud. And let's face it, if someone did hear him, it would have just been another way that they could make fun of him. How many times have you as a Christian been made fun of for praying? This prayer was preserved somehow because we're reading about it. Now think about that. Because according to this book, no one lives to tell the tale. Not even Samson. We read, and said, O Lord, remember me, I pray thee. This right here, brothers and sisters, is a prayer of repentance. He's expressing his trust. The verse says, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God. This was a prayer of faith because it was heard, it was accepted, and it was answered, wasn't it? And again, this verse shows us Samson's strength did not come from his hair, it came from his communicating with the Lord. The verse then tells us, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. He says, once avenged, once and for all, no more. He wants to take his last and final vengeance on these oppressors. One vengeance for 2 eyes. This was not being said for private revenge of his injuries. This is being said as a magistrate, as a judge. Now, I do realize that he mentions his eyes, but he did suffer their loss, and so much more. They injured him in so many ways. This prayer right here restores his relationship with God. Samson wants that strength back one last time so that he can take vengeance on these Philistines who are his enemies. and the enemies of God. Amen. And they were, like I said, they were Samson's enemies. They gouged out his eyes. He wants vengeance. Archaeology tells us that some Philistine temples, they did have a roof that did overlook a courtyard. And they were held up by these wooden columns that were planted into a stone foundation. Now the central pillars were set close together so that they could, give extra support to that roof. So what we see here in this story was that the celebration and the taunting of Samson had drawn this huge crowd. Samson gets his strength back, fresh from God. It gives him this strength to buckle these two columns. Then the roof collapses, and the victory belongs to Israel. Samson died for his country and for God. No, this is not suicide. I want to make sure you understand that what we're reading here is not suicide. This is God casting judgment on his enemies, and Samson is willing to lay down his life for God. Even though Samson was a man who had passion that left him capable of, let's face it, very severe sin, he still was the greatest champion of Israel. And like I said many times, he's listed with the faithful in that verse in Hebrews 11:32. Now let's look at verse 29 now. And Samson took hold of those two middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with his right and the other with his left. Now, I know that many people, they love to object to the thought that a building this spacious could have ever even existed. But we've already discussed, archaeology's proven that they have. But see, with the thought of these things being supported by two pillars that were in the middle, like this, and they were so close that Samson was able to reach between them. But I don't know if you remember, a while back I mentioned in one of our videos that there's a color of blue that we know existed, but we also do not know what this color looked like because it was lost. I think that that's the case here, that we've lost this knowledge that our ancient ancestors had. So we don't know how to do something like that. Okay? Besides, several authors from back then, people like Pliny, tell us of two rather large Roman theaters that were supported by a single hinge. Also, look up Westminster Hall. It was built over 200 years ago by William Rufus. It's 70 feet long, 74 feet wide, and it has a roof that is the largest in all of Europe. And there's not one pillar on the site. Anyway, does this verse say that there are only two pillars? No. It says that these were the two middle pillars. Who's to say that there weren't other pillars? These were just the two in the middle, two main ones, the ones where most of the weight lay. Now, Kimchi tells us that the words took hold means that he bent them. But I think it was better to take it as that Samson just took hold of them, like the verse tells us. The verse says, one with one hand and one with the other. It says one with the right and one with the left. So it's just like the classic picture. He stood between them with his hands spread out like Jesus on the cross. So it seems like this young man, that he indeed did put Samson's hands, as he asked, between these two main posts that were supporting the building. Verse 30 tells us, and Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his feet were more than they which he slew in his life. Samson says, "Let me die with the Philistines." He's content to die. He's willing to do anything and to be vindicated, of God's glory, which, it had been trampled on. Let's face it. This is not, and let me repeat, this is not like we see terrorists do. They think that, they think that this is an example of the wickedness that they do. No, Samson did not desire to die voluntarily. He did this out of necessity, because he was seeking to fulfill his office as a judge, to destroy his enemies who blasphemed God, who were oppressing God's people. He could not have done this without dying. What we see here is closer to what has happened, in the middle of battle, where someone's running into a cannon. Samson did this using divine instincts. He had the approval from God because God did answer his prayer. This is another way that Samson is like Jesus. He died voluntarily. He destroyed the enemies of God. God strengthened Samson. The temple of Dagon fell. All 3,000 of the guests indeed did die when that building fell. In doing this, Samson delivers a major blow to the Philistines. He kills so many Philistines. We do not know the exact number, though. Think about Samson and what this shows us. It shows us how one man can do so much if he has God on his side. In the whole story, Samson does this all alone because he has God with him. He literally kills thousands of Philistines. When you have God at your side, you are the majority. No matter how large your enemy is, you are the majority. They are the ones who are at a disadvantage. Okay. So we're finally here at the last verse, verse 31. And it reads, "Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel for 20 years." This even seems to have paralyzed the Philistines. They do not try to prevent Israel from retrieving Samson's body. They do not oppress Israel for a very long time after this. After this, Samson was regarded as the greatest of the champions. Sadly, though, the way that he gave in to his passions was frowned upon, and it lessened the respect that he should have gotten. But again, Samson is listed in the hall of the faithful in Hebrews 11:32. We never read of his mother having any other children. We do know that when he was born, she did not have any children. So we do not know if the brethren that is mentioned here were his brothers, or if they were, one of the Danites, his tribe. Remember, they were indebted to Samson. And what we're reading here is that they found his body and they buried it in his father's burying place. So we finished the story of Samson and Delilah. So be ready. Next week we'll be reading of the idolatry of Micah. This is a story that I've been waiting to do for a long time. So I hope that I did it justice for you guys and that I taught you something out of it. Again, this being able to be here with you guys every Sunday means a lot to me. It's always great to be here. Your guys' continued prayer for Jennifer's greatly appreciated. It means a lot. It's a long road. It's a long road. Me and the boys have been doing good. She's been doing good. She's actually been up, standing around. She's not just laying in bed anymore. So that's good. I hope that you all, like I said, I hope you all got something out of the message today. I pray the Lord continues to bless you and keep you, and I hope you all come back next week. Again, I like to point out, if you have not already, please like and subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up with me and know when I'm here if you're not on my Facebook or Twitter, and you'll be able to find us easier if you want to continue to watch. It means a lot to me. So thank you all. God bless you and keep you, and I'll see you all here next week for an all new Sermons in the Park. Thank you again.